The universe, as it turns out, had developed quite the sophisticated system for determining who gets to eat whom. Not literally, of course. That would be barbaric. No, the Zephyrian Empire had evolved something far more elegant, a comprehensive biological hierarchy based on scent markers, pheromone signatures, and what their scientists diplomatically termed predatory resonance frequencies. It was all very scientific, very proper. Very much designed to ensure that beings like the Vorthak never had to question their position at the top of the food chain. The Vorthak, for their part, had turned this natural order into something of an art form. Standing nearly 3 meters tall on powerful digitigrade legs, with chitinous plating that could deflect plasma bolts and mandibles capable of crushing titanium steel alloys, they were nature's gift to the concept of apex predation. Their very presence triggered fight-or-flight responses in roughly 87% of known sentient species, a statistic they wore like a badge of honor. Captain Vex'thara of the raider vessel Crimson Mandate was particularly proud of these numbers. He'd spent the better part of 2 centuries perfecting what he called educational encounters, carefully orchestrated hijackings designed not for profit, but for the far nobler purpose of reminding the galaxy's lesser species exactly where they stood in the grand scheme of things. You see, he would often explain to his crew during their pre-raid briefings, his translator rendering his clicking vocalizations into perfect galactic standard. Piracy is crude, theft is beneath us, but education? Education is a service to the cosmic order itself. His current target, the luxury passenger liner Stellar Dominion, represented a perfect opportunity for such enlightenment. The ship's manifest read like a catalogue of the galaxy's most delightfully terrified species, Quillan merchants whose feather crests would flatten at the first whiff of Vorthak pheromones, Deltarian bureaucrats whose bioluminescent patches would strobe in panic patterns, and a delightful collection of hegemony diplomats whose entire evolutionary strategy revolved around looking as non-threatening as possible. The Stellar Dominion herself was one of those obscenely opulent vessels that the Centauri cruise lines like to market as a slice of paradise among the stars. Her passenger decks featured artificial gravity gardens, molecular gastronomy restaurants, and observation lounges with transparent aluminum viewports offering breathtaking vistas of whatever stellar phenomenon they happened to be passing. It was exactly the sort of place where soft, civilized beings went to forget that the universe was fundamentally a dangerous place. Captain Vex'thara intended to remind them. The boarding action proceeded with characteristic Vorthak precision. Their assault shuttles, sleek, predatory things that looked like they'd been designed by someone with strong opinions about intimidation, docked with barely a whisper against the liner's hull. The ship's security force, consisting primarily of hired Centauri guards whose species had long ago traded martial prowess for commercial success, surrendered with gratifying promptness. Within minutes, Vex'thara and his boarding party had secured the main passenger deck, herding the various aliens into the grand salon with the kind of casual efficiency that spoke to extensive practice. The grand salon of the Stellar Dominion had been designed to impress. Soaring ceilings disappeared into holographic star fields, while the deck featured real Altarian marble inlaid with veins of crystallized dark matter. Under normal circumstances, it was the sort of place where well-heeled travelers might sip exotic liqueurs while discussing the latest developments in trans-dimensional art or quantum poetry. At the moment, however, it more closely resembled a very upscale hostage situation. Vex'thara surveyed his audience with the satisfaction of a professor preparing to deliver a particularly important lecture. The assembled passengers had arranged themselves according to instinct. The smaller, more obviously prey-like species clustered toward the center of the room, while those with even pretensions to predatory status had spread themselves along the edges, trying to look inconspicuous. "Greetings," he began, his voice carrying easily across the salon without need for amplification. Vorthak vocal cords had evolved to carry across vast distances, the better to coordinate pack hunts. I am Captain Vex'thara of the Crimson Mandate. You may consider this an educational opportunity. A Quillan merchant near the front, identifiable by his iridescent plumage and the way his crest had flattened against his skull in terror, made a small whimpering sound. Vex'thara nodded approvingly. Excellent response. Note how our friend here demonstrates proper prey behavior, the immediate recognition of danger, the appropriate submissive posturing. This is how the natural order functions. He gestured to one of his subordinates. Vex'thara, begin the demonstration. The designated Vorthak warrior stepped forward. His bioluminescent threat displays pulsing in slow, hypnotic patterns. The effect on the gathered passengers was immediate and gratifying. Stress pheromones flooded the air, a complex bouquet of chemical panic that registered on Vorthak olfactory sensors like a fine wine. Observe, Vex'thara continued, pacing slowly around the perimeter of the group, how each species exhibits its evolved response to superior predatory presence. The Deltarians have shifted to their camouflage coloration. Note the mottled green pattern. The hegemony representatives have clustered together, seeking safety in numbers, and our Quillan friends have gone perfectly still, hoping to avoid drawing attention. It was, he had to admit, a textbook example of galactic hierarchy in action. Every being in the room was behaving exactly as their evolutionary programming dictated when confronted with an apex predator. It was beautiful, really, natural, proper, which made what happened next all the more perplexing. A figure detached itself from the maintenance alcove where it had apparently been working on some sort of atmospheric recycling unit. Humanoid in basic structure, bipedal, with the sort of unremarkable features that suggested a species somewhere in the middle of the galactic food chain. The being, male, judging by the facial hair and general proportions, wiped his hands on a stained work coverall and glanced around the salon with mild interest. "Oh, hey," he said, his voice carrying the sort of casual tone one might use when encountering neighbors in a hallway. "Everything okay out here?" I heard some commotion. Vex'thara paused mid-stride. In his considerable experience, this was not how prey species were supposed to react to the sight of armed Vorthak warriors. There should have been cowering, stress pheromones, possibly some form of involuntary biological evacuation. Instead, the newcomer seemed to be waiting for an answer to what appeared to be a genuine question about their well-being. Vex'thara began, then caught himself. This was clearly some sort of shock response. The being was obviously so terrified that its higher brain functions had shut down entirely. "You will join the others immediately." The human, for that's what the ship's manifest had listed him as, one Jasper Kowalski, maintenance technician 3rd class, glanced at the assembled passengers, then back at Vex'thara. "Are we doing some kind of drill?" he asked, "because I should probably finish calibrating the atmospheric scrubbers first. The CO2 levels in Section 7 are getting a bit wonky." What followed could only be described as the most politely bewildering conversation in the history of interstellar piracy. "You will," Vex'thara said, drawing himself up to his full, impressive height, "immediately comply with my instructions or face the consequences of defying a superior predator." Jasper scratched his chin, leaving a small streak of lubricant oil. "Superior predator? Oh, you mean like an ecological thing? Are you some kind of scientist?" The other passengers watched this exchange with the sort of fascinated horror typically reserved for impending vehicular accidents. Several Deltarians had begun flashing emergency bioluminescent patterns, while the Quillan merchants were producing sounds that their species typically made only when witnessing the heat death of the universe. "I am Vorthak," Vex'thara stated, as if this should clarify everything. "Cool," Jasper replied with genuine interest. "I don't think I've met any Vorthak before." "You guys are from the Zephyrian sectors, right? I read about your homeworld in a maintenance manual once. Something about extreme gravity and sulfur-based atmospheric composition? Must be rough on the equipment." Vex'thara found himself In the unprecedented position of having his intimidating species introduction met with what appeared to be professional curiosity about environmental engineering challenges. "We are apex predators," he tried again, emphasizing each word carefully. "Oh, like wolves or sharks back on Earth. That's neat." Jasper nodded approvingly. "Evolution's pretty wild, isn't it? The way different environments produce different solutions to survival problems." "Earth?" Vex'thara seized on this as potentially relevant information. "You are from the human homeworld?" "Well, originally, but I've been working the merchant routes for about 15 years now. Maintenance work, you know how it is. Ships break down, someone's got to fix them." Jasper gestured vaguely at his tools. "Speaking of which, I really should get back to those scrubbers. The atmospheric composition gets off by even a few parts per million, and suddenly everyone's complaining about headaches." Vex'thara activated his bioscanner, running a full spectral analysis on the human. The results were confusing. According to his equipment, Jasper Kowalski registered as neither predator nor prey. The human's scent markers were completely neutral. His pheromone output suggested mild interest rather than appropriate terror, and his threat assessment readings were fluctuating wildly between harmless maintenance worker and possible scanning error. "What is your species' position in the galactic hierarchy?" Vex'thara demanded. "Hierarchy?" Jasper looked puzzled. "I mean, I guess there's the usual corporate structure. I report to Chief Engineer Martinez, she reports to the department head, he reports to the captain. Pretty standard stuff." "Why?" This was not going according to the educational plan. Vex'thara tried a different approach. He activated his intimidation display, a complex combination of threat postures, pheromone releases, and subsonic vocalizations that had been refined over millions of years of Vorthak evolution. It was a presentation that could reduce most sapient beings to quivering terror within seconds. Jasper watched with polite attention, the way one might observe a street performer doing something moderately interesting. "That's pretty impressive," he said when the display concluded. "Is it some kind of communication method? Like sign language, but with your whole body?" It was at this point that Jasper's stomach chose to make its presence known with a sound that could best be described as aggressively biological. He glanced down at himself with mild embarrassment. "Sorry about that. I was supposed to take my lunch break an hour ago, but then the scrubbers started acting up and you know how it is." He looked around at the assembled crowd. "Don't let me interrupt whatever you're doing here. Educational thing, right?" Without waiting for a response, Jasper walked over to where he'd left his work kit and retrieved a battered metal lunchbox that had clearly seen better decades. The thing looked like it had been through several small wars and possibly a few large ones. "What?" Vex'thara asked with growing fascination. "Is that?" "Lunch," Jasper replied, settling cross-legged on the marble floor with the casual ease of someone accustomed to eating in uncomfortable places. He popped the latches with a satisfying click. The smell hit the assembled crowd like a physical force. Every non-human in the salon immediately began exhibiting signs of acute chemical distress. The Deltarians' bioluminescent patches strobed in patterns that roughly translated to "poison detected, evacuate immediately." The Quillan merchants produced sounds typically associated with their species' funeral rites. Even the Vorthak warriors took several involuntary steps backward, their threat displays flickering uncertainly. "Holy cosmic void," wheezed one of the hegemony diplomats, his translator struggling with what sounded like a prayer for swift death. "What is that?" Jasper paused in the act of unwrapping what appeared to be a sandwich constructed from materials that violated several interstellar chemical weapons treaties. "Oh, this? It's just a ghost pepper and Carolina Reaper sandwich with some habanero spread. You know, standard Earth food." He took a bite that by all rights should have killed him instantly. "Want some?" The collective response was immediate and universal. Every non-human in the room took several large steps away from the apparently suicidal maintenance worker. "You're eating that voluntarily?" Threxaval asked, his voice carrying a note of species-deep horror that his translator couldn't quite mask. Sure, Jasper replied around another bite. It's got good flavor. Little bit of a kick to it. Threxaval's bioscanner was now showing readings that suggested the human was consuming concentrated capsaicin compounds at levels that would constitute lethal chemical warfare against most known species. According to his database, the compounds in that sandwich could theoretically be weaponized to clear entire city blocks. How, he asked with the sort of academic fascination that sometimes overcomes mortal terror, are you not dead? Jasper shrugged. Humans like spicy food, builds character. Spicy food. Threxaval repeated the words as if they contained some fundamental truth about the universe that he'd been missing his entire life. Yeah, you know, capsaicin, piperine, allicin, the usual stuff. Jasper took another bite. Back on Earth, we've been eating this kind of thing for thousands of years. Great for the metabolism. The implications of this began to sink in. Here was a species that not only tolerated, but actively sought out chemical compounds that most of the galaxy classified as industrial solvents. They consumed them recreationally, for flavor. What else? Threxaval found himself asking with morbid curiosity. Do humans eat? What followed was the most terrifying dining conversation in recorded galactic history. Well, Jasper said, pulling out what appeared to be a thermos of liquid that was giving off visible fumes, there's this coffee. It's made from beans that have been through a digestive process, not human digestive, obviously. There's this animal on Earth called a civet, and they eat the coffee berries, but their stomachs don't break down the actual beans, so you collect the beans after they've been, processed naturally, and then you roast them and brew them into a beverage. The Deltarians had begun making high-pitched keening sounds. You drink processed excrement? One of the Vorthak warriors asked weakly. Oh, it's not the excrement part that makes it good, Jasper clarified cheerfully. It's the fermentation process in the digestive tract that breaks down the proteins and reduces the acidity. Makes for a smoother cup. Very expensive, actually. This stuff costs about 300 credits per kilogram. Threxaval felt something that he was beginning to recognize as a fundamental shift in his understanding of galactic power structures. What other recreational activities do humans engage in? Well, there's long-distance running. Humans are actually pretty good persistence hunters. We can't run as fast as most prey species, but we can keep going basically forever. We just follow them at a steady pace until they collapse from exhaustion. The Quillen merchant made a sound like air escaping from a punctured breathing apparatus. Back on Earth, our ancestors used to hunt megafauna that way. These huge mammoth-type creatures that were way bigger and stronger than us. We'd just follow them around for days, weeks sometimes, until they literally couldn't run anymore. Then we'd walk up and finish them off. Your species, Threxaval said slowly, are endurance predators. I guess. I mean, we don't really hunt much anymore. Mostly we just run for exercise now. Marathons, ultramarathons, that kind of thing. There are humans who run 100 miles just for fun. One of the hegemony diplomats had begun rocking back and forth while muttering what sounded like mathematical equations for calculating interstellar distances and escape velocities. But that's nothing compared to some of the extreme sports, Jasper continued conversationally. There's this thing called base jumping, where you throw yourself off cliffs wearing these fabric wings, or free climbing where you scale vertical rock faces without any safety equipment. Oh, and there's this sport called rugby, where two teams basically try to beat each other unconscious while fighting over a ball. You engage in recreational combat? Threxaval's voice had climbed several octaves. Sure, boxing, mixed martial arts, American football. That last one's particularly fun. Two groups of armored humans running into each other at high speed repeatedly. Lots of concussions, but that's part of the excitement. Threxaval was beginning to understand why his bioscanner couldn't properly classify humans. They weren't prey, Prey species didn't voluntarily consume industrial chemicals or throw themselves off cliffs for entertainment, but they weren't predators in any recognizable sense either. They were something else entirely. They were terrifying. "Captain," one of his warriors whispered urgently, "perhaps we should consider concluding this educational session." Vex'thara found himself nodding in agreement. The lesson had definitely been learned, though not by whom he'd originally intended. "Yes," he said, backing slowly toward the exit. "I believe everyone has learned quite enough about natural hierarchies today." Jasper looked up from his sandwich with mild confusion. "You guys leaving already?" "I was just getting to the interesting stuff about human warfare tactics. Did you know that during one of our world wars, humans developed a strategy called island hopping, where they would literally fight their way across entire ocean systems, conquering fortified positions one by one through sheer determination and industrial capacity? The sound of rapidly retreating Vorthak warriors was the only response. 20 minutes later, the Stellar Dominion was once again proceeding peacefully through hyperspace, her passengers gradually recovering from what would later be classified in the official incident reports as an educational encounter with species reclassification implications. Jasper had finished his lunch and returned to the atmospheric scrubbers, which were now functioning within acceptable parameters. The ghost pepper sandwich had been properly metabolized, his coffee was still warm, and the universe had returned to its normal state of being generally predictable. The other passengers, however, were experiencing what psychologists might term a fundamental paradigm adjustment. "Did you know," one of the Deltarian businessmen was saying to his companion, "that humans voluntarily put themselves in metal tubes and fire themselves into space at velocities that would liquefy most organic tissue?" "I heard," whispered a Quillen merchant, "that they have a saying, 'Hold my beer and watch this.' Apparently, it precedes most of their species' greatest achievements." The hegemony diplomats were having an animated discussion about revising their species' first contact protocols to include specific warnings about human dietary habits and recreational preferences. Captain Vex'thara, meanwhile, was updating the Vorthak Imperial database with a new species classification. "Humans, approach with extreme caution. Recommend immediate reclassification from unknown/neutral to cosmic horror masquerading as maintenance personnel. Do not engage in educational demonstrations. Do not accept food offerings. Do not inquire about recreational activities." The universe, as it turned out, was considerably more complicated than anyone had originally thought. The carefully constructed hierarchies of predator and prey, the elegant systems of biological intimidation, the entire cosmic order that species like the Vorthak had spent millennia perfecting, all of it had just been casually dismantled by a maintenance worker with a lunchbox and a tendency toward conversational oversharing. It was, Vex'thara reflected as his ship jumped to hyperspace, probably the most valuable education any of them had ever received, though he suspected it might take him several years of therapy to properly process the experience. Back on the Stellar Dominion, Jasper closed his lunchbox and checked his chronometer. His shift was almost over, and Chief Martinez would want a full report on the atmospheric systems. He gathered his tools, made a final adjustment to the scrubber calibrations, and headed for the maintenance bay. Behind him, the grand salon remained unusually quiet. The other passengers were still processing their own educational experience, namely, the discovery that the universe contained beings who were simultaneously harmless enough to fix air recyclers and terrifying enough to make apex predators flee in existential crisis. As Jasper passed the observation lounge, he paused to check the stellar navigation display. They were making good time to the Centauri station. With luck, he'd be able to get the parts he needed for the gravity generator and maybe grab a decent meal that didn't come from a lunchbox. He was thinking about trying that new Altarian restaurant on Station 7. Apparently they served something called volcanic flame squid that was supposed to be quite spicy. It sounded delicious.